Hey friends, welcome. Appreciate you being here. I'm really excited to have Mark Gober today. Had a few great conversations with him over the last little bit of time and really enjoy his material and listen to a lot of the podcasts that he's on and highly recommend. So Mark, welcome. How you doing today, brother?
I'm doing great, Joel. Thank you for having me on.
Thanks, man. Yeah, appreciate you making the time. So I'd like for you to kind of share how the hell you ended up getting out of the world you were in and whether you got whiplash or not from having such a change of view around how you saw the world. I've heard your story quite a bit, but you were a professional banker and then working in Silicon Valley, and things seemed to be going in a direction where you were going to stay in that world, and then something changed.
Basically, yeah, I had a life that was focused on achievement and accomplishing challenging things that were in front of me
Yeah,
without really having a sense of purpose or meaning behind it.
sure.
So it started in school, wanting to get good grades, and then I was a competitive tennis player, so wanting to win in tennis, and then it was trying to get the good job, and it just was this treadmill
Yeah.
that I could see myself on over a long enough period of time where I realized, okay, I would achieve the goal that I wanted, but then I ended up at a baseline level of happiness, or I wouldn't achieve the thing I wanted and I would get really upset. And I didn't have a container for how to think about any of this stuff.
Mm.
And things started to change for me in 2016. In hindsight, I turned 30 then, so it could have been a Saturn return astrologically, something like that. But it was a big shakeup for me. And it was probably, there was a lead up a few years before it I could point to where I just felt like I had no sense of meaning or purpose in life. There were some personal and professional things that didn't go the way I wanted around that time, and I felt super lost. I remember telling people I felt like a zombie at that
Mm.
point, but in my mind, I had a metaphysical perspective that I held on to really tightly, which was that we live in a universe that's random and meaningless. So everything is happening not because of any underlying intelligence. It's all because of random interactions of particles. And that leads to everything in the world, including events in our lives. And there's no meaning behind any of that beyond what we create in our own mind. And that to you might sound kind of crazy and probably to your audience because you have a very
Yeah.
highly conscious audience, but that is the worldview that is basically endorsed by mainstream science. Whether they will say it that way or not, the
Mhm.
implication of modern science is what I just described. It's a very nihilistic, agnostic, or atheistic worldview, and I was squarely there. So I remember thinking to myself as I was going through these ups and downs, especially the downs, well, none of this really matters, Mark, because you're going to die anyway. And once you die, that's the end of your consciousness. It's going to be lights out. So none of this matters.
Right.
So 2016 hits. I'm in this state of being a zombie, and I start listening to podcasts.
Mhm.
That led me to explore just new ideas about personal development and health. Initially, I went into float tanks, so sensory deprivation, sitting in tanks of salt water, and there's
Yeah.
so much salt in the water that the full body floats. And you can close the top of the tank, so there's no light, no sound, and it's basically meditation on steroids. I didn't realize at the time what it was, but I was exploring that. And I had heard that people would have sometimes psychedelic experiences in the tank without having to take something. So I thought that was interesting. I didn't have any crazy experiences. Maybe saw some colors, had some memories come back, but I wasn't looking at it as a spiritual exercise. It was more of just how can I find more happiness in life? And this was seemed like an interesting thing to do. And I kept listening to alternative health shows and then came across one show called Extreme Health Radio and was listening to people cure themselves of cancer and all sorts of ailments using alternative medicine. So there was clearly a part of me that was open-minded to things. But then what I wasn't expecting is they interviewed a woman talking about psychic abilities and communicating with interdimensional beings. And the hosts of the show, I thought they were very rational people because I heard them on so many other episodes. So I was confused. I'm like, wait, they're taking this woman seriously. Her name's Laura Powers, and now she's a friend, but she practices psychic abilities. And I'm like, wait, is so they're saying that she's right about this stuff? Is she delusional? I don't think she's lying. I don't know what's going on. And then I ended up listening to Laura's podcast, which she mentioned on her own. It's called Healing Powers. And I just binged her whole podcast because I was driving an hour each way to and from work in the Bay Area from San Francisco down to Silicon Valley. Her episodes are pretty short usually. So I listened to all of her episodes from 2016 back to 2011, and I was hearing person after person describing this very mystical worldview. They were talking about psychic phenomena. They were talking about the afterlife, sometimes even reincarnation. the idea of an interconnected reality that is inherently spiritual, and a oneness that they were describing. And I got to the point where I said, if even 1% of this stuff is real, then I have to rethink my whole life. But how could any of this stuff be real? Because no one in my network or anyone I know adheres to this stuff. And is it possible that there's so many smart people that I know who don't
Yeah.
understand the nature of reality? And then I started to read books and peer-reviewed literature and declassified documents from the US government. And I was seeing all the evidence converge in the direction of what I heard on those initial podcasts. So in long story short, that exploration in 2016 has led me to write a series of 7 books on a variety of topics. Ultimately, I left my job in Silicon Valley. I spent a whole career making it to partner and decided I just wanted to leave to explore these things. And I guess where I am now is I'm really not sure about anything. And I spent a lot of time researching the nature of reality. And I spent a lot of time researching the nature of myself and trying to overcome the hurdles in my internal world.
Wow. Well said, man. Wow. What a powerful transformation. Thank you for having the courage to share and, be vulnerable and honest about how dense you were, and that's really helpful to know that someone from your world can kind of be extracted. And I know it wasn't willing. It sounds like you were kind of pulled out of the world rather than chose to jump, but that's still kudos to you for being able to speak to it so well, and giving other people potentially permission to do the same. I think there are people out in the world doing the 9 to 5 thing or whatever that feel that there's more to this world, and they intuit that, but they're terrified to kind of unlock that longing and really admit to themselves that they're suffering. And so they are either drinking or doing something to sort of keep that part of themselves cut off. And it takes a lot of courage just to go into float tanks or to explore meditation as a means to know oneself. And a lot of my audience, we take it a little past meditation to where you are having vision, you are able to see other layers of the onion. And that's what's really validating when you get to do it for yourself. It's one thing to hear other people do it, but when it happens to you, it's really healing because there's a breakthrough uh in that the validation makes you no longer question whether or not your intuition is accurate, and you start to trust your intuition more, right? So that's that building of that muscle. And so was there challenges that came with family, friends, peers? Did you offend people? Did you trigger people? How's the family thing been? Are you able to still talk to your parents? Or are they like, what the hell are you doing, Mark?
Fortunately, my family has been pretty supportive. I have more of a mainstream family, I would say,
Yeah.
but they read my books and they give
Wow.
feedback. And even if not everyone agrees with everything I'm saying, they're at least aware of what I'm doing. So I think I've been pretty lucky in that regard.
Wow.
But it has felt a bit isolating because so much of my network is not on the same page with what I'm doing. Not that they necessarily disagree, but some people might hear what I'm talking about and then just go in a different direction. So, for example, one of my friends who's highly educated doctor, he said to me after my first book came out, An End to Upside Down Thinking, that he said, Mark, you're probably right about a lot of this stuff, but my life is good the way it is, and I don't want to rock the boat, so I'm not going to go there.
Yeah.
So there's some of that. What I do find, though, Joel, is that people come out of the woodworks when there is some major crisis in their life, and then they want to talk to me, especially around death and dying.
Cool. And do you offer that? Do you serve as a mentor coach at all?
Not formally. I'm always happy to talk to people, and
Cool.
I provide resources and I can share my own experience. But I've learned over this period of 9 years to let go of other people's
Yeah.
willingness to grab onto the stuff. And now, in the beginning, I was just so excited to share everything, and I wanted people to accept it because I thought it was such a life-changing thing. But what I realize now is that everyone's on their own time
Yeah.
horizon. Maybe me prior to 2016, I wouldn't have been open to this stuff, but I do like to put information out so that people can be ready for it. But I also want to add on to your question about how people have reacted, because I've gone into so many different areas. They've reacted differently depending on the subject matter. So let's
Mhm.
say the first 2 books, An End to Upside Down Thinking and An End to Upside Down Living, are about the science of spiritual realities, near-death experiences, psychic abilities, so forth, and then the implications for how to think about living life. That certainly offends many people because they have a more physicalist worldview where they think everything is just made out of matter and anything spiritual is superstition.
Mhm.
But then I moved into the political realm, and that was actually the most stressful part of my entire journey. 2021, when my book An End to Upside Down Liberty came out. And if you remember in 2021, how highly divided the world was. I mean, it is today, but it was so polarized politically.
Yeah.
And I was coming out with a book after having not spoken about politics. I wasn't even, prior to 2020, I didn't care about politics at all. I really didn't know the difference between Democrats and Republicans. I was
Yeah.
that ignorant because I just didn't care. Unless there was legislation that affected my work, then I would pay attention. But I didn't really care. 2020, we all had to pay attention because the decisions of politicians directly affected everyday life for us. And some people thought it affected their safety. Some people thought it affected their freedom. And I had people on both sides of the aisle. And I'm like, wait, I respect these people in a lot of other ways, but I agree with you on this, but not on that.
Yeah.
Especially from the spiritual community, I found in 2020, many of the people that I was resonating with in terms of spiritual philosophy, they were going along with the mainstream narrative and
Yes.
believing the pharmaceutical industry a bit more, believing the media. And in terms of political leanings, it was more on the left that I
Yeah.
found them to be wanting the government to take control more. And I had a negative reaction to that. So I had this conundrum of, wait a second, I respect someone in certain ways, but I think they're falling for the dark side. What's
Mhm.
going on? So I wrote this book, An End to Upside Down Liberty, which challenges the notion of government itself entirely, and it advocates for something known as voluntarism, which is basically privatizing all government functions and getting rid of the compulsory political monopoly that we call government. And I knew that with certain people would be upset by it and I would lose certain people. So that was a very stressful time. And that pattern has repeated a bit in terms of the political polarization, where might pigeonhole me because of certain positions on freedom that I'll take. And then it's been amplified as I've written about medicine, for example, and challenging the allopathic approach and elements of germ theory, and then more recently challenging all elements of cosmology. And so I've had to develop an internal conviction with all this stuff where each paradigm shift that I'm sharing is a test, is what it feels like. And what I find is that if I'm able to come up with an argument that I feel is strong enough, and I'm not taking positions that are going beyond what can be demonstrated with science or logic, then I'm going to put it out there. And if people don't resonate with it, that's fine. And what I find is that it opens up new doors that I didn't expect. All
Yeah.
these people come in that I didn't even know about who then resonate with me. So there's been the shedding of certain people, often not through that much conflict. It's more of just a drifting away.
Mhm.
And then the new people coming in with, as I get into my own authenticity and share what I think is very important based on the research I do.
Mm. Right. Yeah, totally. That's amazing. I'm glad you were able to find people to connect to in this world because a lot of my friends during 2020, rather than uh, go online, they just isolated and just really went inward because they didn't want to do things online. They wanted to keep it all in person. And then, so their world got really small. But by you sharing and putting yourself out there and making yourself available, there's people can reach out to you. And it's so cool to be at places like Music and Sky and you got to go to Confluence. And I did want to ask about that because the email you shared with me was that, there was like a real profound shift that happened for a lot of you in this last gathering. And so I guess the question goes along with, are you encouraged or discouraged by what you've learned? And what are you seeing by being part of a community of people that are truly trying to come to terms with what is the nature of our reality and how can we thrive in this realm in general?
I am overall very encouraged. It seems that
Ah,
there is a new society that's basically being built with
yeah,
a new consciousness. And the Music and Sky and Confluence communities are the epicenter that I've found. There's also a festival in Australia that I'll be speaking at in this August of 2025, the Living Free Festival. And I
cool.
haven't been before, but I've heard it's very similar to Music and Sky and Confluence, just the Australia version. But
Awesome.
let me take you a bit through my journey from isolation into community, because it's
Yes.
kind of been, I was in a community before, prior to 2020, or let's say 2016. Then I started to move out of that a bit as my interests were shifting. And then I
Mhm.
had some new community forming in the spiritual worlds. Then 2020 hit. I didn't know where I was. I had just left my job. I had such different worldview about politics and medicine than people that I knew. I felt pretty isolated. I went into an intense meditation phase. So when I left my job for the first time, because I was working in client services, I used to be always on call. For the first
Mm.
time, I was able to not be on call. So I went on 2 silent meditation retreats in Northern California, one
Wow.
with Adyashanti, another with his wife Mukti. They were roughly a week long each, and I'd never done anything quite like that. And then after those retreats, I meditated hours a day for a year straight. It was about 5 hours on average per day, up to
Wow.
10 hours a day. I did 10 days straight of 10 hours, usually 1 to 2 hour chunks. So I was pretty isolated in that period, spent a lot of time with family, but didn't really have that many people to talk to because of the way the world was. And I was very strongly in the freedom movement, especially health freedom. And then I wrote the book on liberty that opened up a few new doors. And it wasn't for me until 2023 where I felt the community really building. The first hint of it was a festival in Franklin, Tennessee. Courtney Turner hosted it. It's
Mm.
called Rebels for a Cause. She hosts the Courtney Turner podcast, which I recommend to your audience. She does a great job looking at the social engineering in the world. And I've been on her show a number of times. But I went there and I met Alex Zek and Mike Winter for the first time. That was, I think, June, end of May or June 2023.
Mm.
And so it was great to be with Mike and Alec and to see the kinds of communities that they were starting to build. And because I had kind of met them online before that, but not really talked to them much. And that festival was, I would say, more politically charged, more right wing, but there was some spiritual stuff in it. So Alec, Mike, and I had we weren't quite as politically charged on all that stuff, even though of
Right.
course we were all very pro freedom people. So I got to spend some good time with them, and they
Cool.
invited me to be on The End of COVID, which I also recommend to your audience. It's available at theendofcovid.com. It's an online library of like 100+ hours talking about germ theory, health. I was participating not to talk about medicine, but to talk about the World Economic Forum and freedom generally and voluntarism. But because I was on that forum, I got to listen to the other participants and the other lectures, and I got to learn about medicine, and that brought me into the whole medical fold and then cosmology. But because I wrote about the medicine book and questioning germ theory, Alex said, "You've got to come to Texas and be on my podcast." So that
Cool.
was fall of 2023. And he's like, "Mark, you got to come to Confluence. We just had an event this fall. There's going to be one April 2024." And I said, "I don't really know what that is, but I'm coming." So I showed up to Confluence April 2024. And that was really the first time I said, whoa, this is a community of people where I don't have to hide anything.
Right.
And they come from very different backgrounds. Everyone is super smart. When I go
Mm.
there, I feel like the people who are not speakers could be speakers.
Sure.
Like everyone has been through a lot in life, but we, even if we have different backgrounds, we seem to come to a very similar place. And I felt great about Confluence last year. And then I went to Music and Sky in Northern
Mm.
California a few months later, and I felt very similar vibe with it. And then came to Confluence this year, a few months ago. And the vibe I got there again, and Confluence is in Bandera, Texas at Sovereignty Ranch, hosted by Molly Engelhardt, and Alex Zek is involved with the way forward.
Yep.
But this year, it felt to me a little bit less about fighting against the system and more about building the new world. And part of that, I think, is because coming out of the 2020 era, there was so much concern that we were all going to be like put in quarantine camps or something. That has subsided a bit. And so people have maybe exhaled and they're like, okay, we've been awakened to a lot of the deceptions, and now we're starting to come up with solutions. And there are people who are doing it in the realm of parenting and education, others in the realm of looking at, like Dr. Stephen A. Young, looking at cosmology as a theoretical physics PhD. So many different people from different angles are trying to piece together what's the nature of reality and how can we live in alignment with that, even if we have to do it in a parallel way. And some people I know are into looking at common law, even beyond voluntarism. How do we extract ourselves from this existing system? So to me, these communities are the most cutting edge thinkers that I've found. So I'm really encouraged that that exists. I could turn on Twitter and look at a bunch of other things and be less encouraged because I'm seeing a lot of infighting and so forth. But I think that that's going to be there. The system is going to do its thing. And I'm way less concerned now about trying to make the system crumble. It's more about, I mean, the system can do its thing, but it's can the rest of us live in our sovereignty regardless of what's happening around us. And I'm feeling better about that now.
Awesome, man. Oh, so good to hear. There's a lot of heavy stuff to listen to around soul trap, or people that go into discovering interdimensional beings, and then we go into a lot of fear. And so the exploration of consciousness can be an incredible healing thing, but it can also lead to a place in which you feel hopeless and incapable of navigating, you know, in earnest, like with really living your life fully because you feel that the deception is too much, right? So it's really helpful when people like you and I and others can speak to that we're in a catalyst moment and that there's a lot of potential depending on the intentions we set and the feelings we're inside of. And then I think there's work we can go and do regarding our past that could clear up the potential for us as individuals. And I think that's why a lot of people are doing deep work and journeys like power plants, ayahuasca and stuff, is there's maybe a quickening occurring where time is not the same as it used to be, and that a lot can happen really quickly. Because I've been feeling things build up over 5 years, and all of a sudden it's like things are just faster and more aligned, and the connections that are being made, everything seems to be coming together. And so I think people spend a lot of their perception is linear, and when you come out of the linear, you can see the bigger picture and intuit your way forward. So your intuition, and you've come out of hypnosis pretty quickly. Has it been emotional? Has it been you've been able to like release tensions and things in the process?
It's been very challenging in a lot of ways. I mean, ultimately beneficial. I
Yeah.
compare it often to a chart of stock prices over a
Yeah.
long period of time. Like the stock market over time goes up, but you'll see ups and downs, and you'll see a recession in between. So it's kind of jagged on an upward trajectory, and that's what it's felt like. And it has felt very accelerated for me. And I've made a very clear intention that I'm trying to get myself to the highest state that I can, whatever
Mhm.
that entails. So it has brought up whatever is still
Yeah.
impure within me or whatever I haven't fully cleared. And there have been so many different modalities and mentors I've worked with over the years, including you, Joel. I really appreciate all of your support as a mentor, and the modalities I've learned from you, the magical passes and the recapitulation exercises going back through memories. I think all highly effective. So I've been, I would say, multimodal, as I've been wanting to try from lots of different perspectives, and different things seem to be needed for me at different times. So maybe
Cool.
something that was great for me 2 years ago, it's not as relevant right in the moment.
Yeah.
And so I think that's important for all of us to know where we are and not be fixated on just one thing, that there might be different things needed in the journey. And part of the reason that I'm, I guess, okay with this trajectory that has its challenges is that when I've studied spiritual awakenings, which was something I did for my second book, An End to Upside Down Living, both in
Mhm.
modern times and also in historical times, there are patterns. Even if people come from different backgrounds, when they have awakenings about the nature of reality and they're on this path of consciously trying to evolve, there's a lot of pain.
Yeah.
And I write about this in the book. The title of the section is "It's Not All Roses,"
Yeah.
because we hear the peak experiences of, well, I felt unconditional love and I felt at one with everything. And sure,
Right.
that is part of reality, but there's a lot of other stuff too. There's a spectrum of darkness and things that we need to shed, whether it's from our own life currently or shedding on behalf of the collective. Some might say a past life or a simultaneous life. I don't know what you want to call it, or ancestral,
Yeah.
or there's so many different things that we might not actually be able to see with our eyes that we're working through. And having that context is very helpful, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it's easier. It's just, it puts a new context on the challenges.
Yeah. Wow. Thanks for your honesty, man. It isn't an easy path to become aware that you exist. I mean, we're in such deep, most of humanity I experience as not being aware uh to the degree that is needed, that they even exist. Like we're under such a spell that to come out of that spell is very vulnerable, it's very exposing, it's very uncomfortable. But the benefits, it's like when you don't want to puke and you're not allowing yourself to purge, and then you finally do, there's a release. And then you go through another round, and emotions can be this way. And I think a lot of men struggle, or not all just men, but a lot of masculine driven people struggle to tap into their pain, and then they avoid it, and then it shows up in their life at the most inconvenient way. And so thank you for speaking to mentors and stuff. Like I work with people as well. I think it's really important piece to be open to, that if you do invest in yourself by getting help, that the universe will find a way to support that. if you're really doing work. And so if I would have waited to get help until I found someone that was perfect, I would have never got help at all. But I had to listen to people that I could tell could help me in particular areas, even though they might not believe the same thing that I do around certain subjects. And that was really tricky for me in 2020, was seeing all the spiritual community fall for the media storylines around the vax and all that, because they were very psychic people and they were very in tune with people's intentions. They could sense my intentions, my subconscious wounds, and they could speak to it. But for them to not be able to see that on a large scale, or whatever happens to people when that kind of glitch occurs between what they're claiming to be and then what they are exposed as, so it's been heartbreaking actually to lose all my mentors, because some things are too far away. I can't connect with people when that division has happened so completely. So I've been so thankful to find people online um, that have been able to assist me in my emotional healing, and just having someone to talk to that I feel is a safe container, someone that's not going to talk about what I said, that is truly an unbiased witness, that is not judging me. And that's hard to find, but we tend to put ourselves above or below people in life. And so when you're working with someone that isn't allowing you to put them on a pedestal and is on the ground with you, speaking to their struggles, then you feel like, oh, okay, this isn't a power dynamic that's unhealthy. It actually is just an opportunity to learn to communicate, because we don't always know what we need to say until we're in a vulnerable moment, and then stuff comes forward. And it's usually the emotional part that needed to move, not the words. And so Toltecs talk about having an experience with silent knowledge, where they're not thinking, but they're able to process regardless. And it sounds sort of strange, but it's not like the thoughts are gone. It's just not the same type of thinking. It's more like magical thinking. And you're so much in your feelings and in your body, and you're dancing and moving. And that's why the magical passes are so powerful. And so, have you ever had a telepathic insight, or has your intuition moved into an area where you felt, you were thinking about someone at the same moment they called, and you sort of start to validate that there's some communication that is beyond just the phone and the email?
Definitely. That started for me pretty quickly in 2016 when I was researching these phenomena and seeing the scientific evidence.
Yeah.
And then it was happening to me. And I
Yeah.
was having synchronicities that were very difficult to explain using just chance. And then I
Mhm.
started to work with people, especially when I started off, I didn't have friends to talk to. So
Yeah.
I began working with energy healers. I would hear someone on a podcast and then I would reach out and do a session. So I was working with psychics, energy healers, past life regression hypnotherapist, between lives hypnotherapist,
Mhm.
basically everything I could try. And that was, I call it my army of counselors. It's kind of started then, where I've always wanted to have these mentors working with me. But sometimes they were also able to know things about me that I couldn't explain because they didn't know anything about me. They couldn't have found it online at the time, or it was something very specific in my life. And that was validating for me to see other people knowing things that I
Mhm.
couldn't explain, and it was validating the science. Or people channeling, for example, and I would see them completely change when they would start to channel some interdimensional being. And I knew that person separately, and I'm like, wait, this is a new person. They don't even use words like that. They don't
Right.
speak with that cadence. So that was experiential validation in that sense. And then also, I agree with what you say about getting into the feelings in the body that aren't always verbalized. So sometimes I find in the emotional processing realm, there will be feelings that come up, and it's sometimes difficult to know exactly why it's there.
Yeah.
So, for example, like sadness or grief, if there's crying that comes up, sometimes it's not even associated with one specific thing. It's like, oh, but that just feels like it needs to come out. And that's been a newer process for me, for sure. I think for men, it's not as much, we're not as encouraged in society to go into the emotional side of it. And I'm not saying I'm perfect at it, but one of the common themes in my research over these years is that a lot of health issues and then emotional issues as well, which can make our life feel less joyful,
Yeah.
relate to suppressed emotions.
Yep.
Dr. David Hawkins is one of my favorite spiritual teachers. I never met him, but I've listened to hundreds of hours of his lectures and read his books. He was a traditionally trained psychiatrist in New York and then had a major spiritual awakening, meditated for years. But he talked a lot about the deconstruction of the ego from the psychiatric perspective and a spiritual perspective. And one of his big pieces of advice is to feel into every feeling fully. And his advice is that if you're feeling something, it means you're actually not feeling enough of it. If you're feeling something, that means there is some part of you that is suppressing it, and therefore you still feel it. If you let the feeling come out fully, it will run out. And he
Yes.
claims he was able to do things such as undergo surgery without anesthetics because he was constantly feeling the feelings fully and letting it go. He accidentally chopped his thumb off and apparently was able to stop the blood and not feel serious pain because he felt it fully. So it's
Mm.
something that I've been trying to practice. It's challenging because we, as humans, and especially in modern society, we're trained to not want to feel the uncomfortable thing. And after doing that for years and years, there are layers. So it's not as easy as it sounds. But eventually, what I find is that the emotions do come out. And as you were alluding to, Joel, life seems to bring the emotions out of us if we're not going to do the work. New circumstances will come, and it might
Yep.
become more and more challenging and more painful until we're forced to let go of it and feel it fully.
Mm. Well said. Yeah, it's yeah, Carlos Castaneda said you don't need a guru. The world will teach you everything you need to know. And that's a really encouraging concept that it's a self-aware world, that we're in a realm that is serving opportunities to us as a means to get to know ourselves. And that's exciting. That means that there's an intelligence, a creator even, or some form of psychedelic attention. When I feel I'm in communication with the creator, it's very psychedelic. It's very like the designer, and it's like it's so cool to be just inside of what it might be like to be this being, because I think we are extensions of this which we but we've been convinced otherwise so thoroughly, that what the Toltecs say, we've been cut off at the knees, compared to what we actually are. And so to like grow those legs and to realize you're a creature that can do all kinds of things. But the problem is people that start to step into their power, as I've heard you talk about, they get tested, whether it's power, money, or sex, right? It's these three pillars of wounds, I guess, that get exposed within our humanity. And so it's a very delicate thing where it's like what the Toltecs say is everyone's either victorious or they're a victim. They're not able to remain neutral. So when you come out of being a victim, now you feel, your ego's then going to be hijacked by a program that is adjust itself accordingly to make sure that you don't get away from that control. So it's a very delicate thing to observe. And I've been in a lot of groups where it started out fairly powerful and clean, and then the leader became corrupted in some level. And so I'd love to hear you share anything you have around that, and why, maybe any thoughts you have on whether there are religions that aren't programs, or if what you've sensed into, and if you are interested in writing more about, yeah, religion, or just going into, because to me there's this science side and then there's this religious side, and they both seem to be very cult minded, and it's hard to kind of talk about like, well, what is there if there's not one or the other? Like even Witsit, I love his capacity, but the religious stuff where you're thinking that the Bible might have these, I'm just curious where you're at with all of that.
Yeah. I mean, religion is an area of high interest for me. I mean, my old life, I would have
Yeah.
said religion is bogus.
Yeah.
And now there's still a part of me that asks questions because I see these are institutions that have power and they need money to survive. And there's reason for having skepticism in these power structures. But I haven't gone deeply enough to have a strong opinion.
Mm.
What I have found in my cursory review is that there are definitely nuggets of truth in all these traditions,
Yeah.
and there are similarities in many of them. But the strict adherence that some people will take, that this book says something and therefore it's true,
Right.
Maybe they're right, but I haven't validated that. I don't know who wrote it or what's been changed. I would have to do a lot of work to get to that point.
Right.
So I'm much more open and just trying to look at what's out there. I talk a lot about just feeling more comfortable saying what's not true, to
Yeah.
look at a claim and to say, okay, we can demonstrate this isn't true, but then I don't know exactly what is true. I just am in a place of I don't know. And if I
Right.
really wanted to go down the religious rabbit hole, which I've wanted to, like to do comparative religion, the issue with that is it takes perhaps a lifetime, maybe even
Yeah.
more than a lifetime, to go deep into one,
Yeah.
and let alone all of them. So I'm just waiting to see what calls me. But I also want to touch on what you said around money, sex, and power, because that's been one of the biggest learnings that I've kept with me in this journey. I learned about it when, especially like my first two books, and then to Upside Down Living in particular, where I talk about spiritual awakenings and the cautions that people give of like,
Yeah.
this is where things can go wrong. Even though it does feel like love and light when you get to high states, there are issues here. And it's not just working through your trauma, there are potential dangers. And there was a spiritual teacher I mentioned in that book who says that she always has multiple mentors at every
Yeah.
time because she wants to make sure there's a mirror to her. And I love that. And that's something I look for in people that are in a teacher role, is how much help are they getting themselves? Because I think every teacher is also a student. I don't think anyone is fully there. So if
Yeah.
someone gets too much in the role of I know it all, that's where these other areas can maybe hook into us. And Mariana Kaplan has written about this extensively when she's looked at awakening journeys and these categories of money, sex, and power as like the three main categories where someone gets taken astray. And they're not bad things on their own. They're not
Right.
inherently bad, but they can be used if there's some wound inside the person, perhaps, or some impurity to manipulate them. And Dr. David Hawkins told a story very often. He felt it was his duty to tell people about this because they might encounter this challenge somewhere in their soul's journey, whether it's in this lifetime or at some other point. But when he reached a very high state of consciousness, he felt like it was just his spirit there. It was just like oneness. And then all of a sudden, he called it a knowingness came to him, basically some kind of other being. And it came to him and said, you've transcended all of your personal karma, so all power is yours. You can take
Yeah.
it. And he said, in the instant, he thought to himself, well, why would I need to have power over others if I am everything? I reject this. And he was then shown all of the people that reached that state before him, or all the souls that reached that state before him, who took the temptation. He called it the Luciferic temptation. And they had to start their soul's journey from the beginning. And he was shown the beings that didn't take the temptation and they reached new elevated states of consciousness. So he said, you're all going to face this at some point. It might be a long time from now. It might come suddenly, but you should be aware that because of the way this realm works, as you described, Joel, the intelligence might know the hooks and it might not be all power is yours, take it. It might be something different.
Yeah.
And so to just be aware of that, that we're the tests are there for us. And another thing I learned in researching that book and End Upside Down Living is in one of the traditions, I believe it was a Sufi leader who said that as you elevate in your consciousness, the implications and consequences of teaching something false are heightened for your soul. So I've been extra careful because if that's even partially true, I don't want to mislead people. So I try to, if I say something, give the appropriate caveats or say, this is what I believe to be true based on the knowledge I have now, because I can understand where that teaching comes from. If you mislead a soul who believes you and they go down a path that's damaging to them, what does that mean for you? So
Yeah.
I just give these ideas and throw them out there because if they're real, they're very significant in terms of our soul's journey.
Amazing. Wow. Yeah. I mean, for me, I truly believe there is an afterlife and that this is a very meaningful opportunity and a platform in which one could move into an experience with timelessness and merge with eternity and become one with all that is. But Castaneda said you can't have, and he didn't mean this in the way people think, but you can't have any debt, you can't have any lies. Like you got to clear things in order to move into that eternal experience. And that's very confronting. But, and it's not like credit card debt. He's referring to like energetic debts, that go unresolved. And it doesn't mean that I can still find that kid that I stole the 40 sack of weed from when I was 14 and pay him back. I may or may not be able to do that, but I can do something in respect of him and give that to somebody that needs it, that same amount of money. And And there's ways to sort of get clear about what might keep us here. Not that this place is negative, but it might not be the only place there is. And we might keep finding ourselves repeating what I call parallel lives. So at the end of this life, I might jump into 500 AD, or who knows what calendar system would be being used, but it's not necessarily linear, one lifetime after another. But if I could make contact with my parallel beings right now while I'm alive as a dreamer, then I can discover the multiplicity of what I am. And then I won't be separate from that. I'll be connected to that higher self aspect of my being that is projecting all of those parallel lives simultaneously. And there's such a beautiful healing that supposedly happens upon encountering that part of you, that other part of you, that other being. And so like my teachers would be feeling like they need to pull a gun out of their pants because in their parallel life they're being chased. So it can cross over. And I've met with people who took a lot of LSD and all of a sudden they have a different accent and they're talking about their children in London, and they're not the same person. Now, so going back to what you said about channeling, that is really intense to be in the presence of somebody that completely let something in their body, basically, which I don't necessarily recommend, but it is intense to observe. And you can tell to me, it's pretty easy to tell when someone's a charlatan and they're pretending to do that versus somebody who's like, there's a presence all of a sudden, and it's kind of uncomfortable because it seems like a little bit of a strange thing to do. So you're in the presence of that intensity. And I think that's kind of what I'm doing, is preparing my being for more and more intensity so that I can be in the presence of non-linear beings. Maybe I could start to see beings that are you can only see at night in the wilderness, and I can start to make out what they look like. Even though they're apparition-like, doesn't mean you can't describe those apparitions. Or maybe I can come to terms with what filters I have that's keeping me from seeing it. Like maybe I'm projecting my own filter onto this apparition and I see it as a scary thing, and maybe it isn't, because of my own wounding around, what is this place? And so a lot of people experience this. They go out in the wilderness at night alone as a means to become aware of what else there is. And they say the Yeti are pretty common. They'll fuck with you. They'll make all these crazy sounds and they'll announce their presence. And you have to be careful. Like Carlos would have to spend the whole night with his shirt wrapped around his belly and like holding himself in like a position in which these things that were all over him, he had to wait till the sun came out. And I've had a lot of these experiences myself where I didn't know if I was going to make it through the night. And when the sun came out, it was like I was reborn, because I was so scared. And so our journey into the moreness and realizing that it is dangerous to open yourself up, to be a channeler, to be a teacher. There's a responsibility that comes with gaining any form of power. Now, the Toltecs point out that you don't have to have social power. You can turn down social power and you can replace it with real power. And that's a very delicate thing to do because we do need to be functional in society, right? But if we're in the merchant mind, where what am I getting out of this? And it's fear-based, then you're going to be keeping your social circle as a means to make sure that you aren't threatening your survival. So that and then a lot of people I notice, they're like keeping friends in their life because they want to make sure there's a lot of people at their funeral or at their wedding. They don't really want those friendships anymore. They've become shallow, but there's some shallow part of them that's holding on. So that's just permission to everyone listening, like getting really honest, whether this is your parents, your grandparents, your sisters, brothers, children even. Is it toxic? Is the relationship toxic? Is there a way that you can heal it? And if not, can you give yourself permission to let it fall apart and go away and even ghost people at times? Because this is our life, not to be sacrificed.
Yeah, I think what you're also speaking to is the need for authenticity.
Yeah.
And to me, authenticity is code for what our soul really wants in this lifetime for us, going into the natural flow of why we're here. And when we do things that are out of that authenticity, what I find is that life brings challenges. They could be emotional challenges, they could manifest as health challenges.
Yeah.
And instead of looking at the pain as a signal to us, we sometimes just fight through it and ignore it and don't see it as our soul directing us. And the way I look at life is that there's some kind of big cosmic puzzle, and
Hmm.
we're each a unique piece, a unique shape. And our goal is to become the purest version of that shape and embody it to do whatever we're here to do. And if we do things in life that are distracting from that shape, I mean, certainly we learn from it, but we want to get to that authentic shape. And there are many possible distractions along the way. So not just perhaps doing things socially that we don't want to do, but these other realms that you describe, and you gave some great cautions that they are very real. I mean, my book, An End to Upside Down Contact, is all about allegations of contact with non-human intelligences. And this has been reported throughout history. And it's not just the UFO phenomenon or abductions, it's people encountering beings in near-death experiences or through channeling or all these other means. And there are other intelligences out there, and sometimes, very often, they're interdimensional. Dr. David Hawkins talked a lot about the allure of glamorous seductions. He said that if things basically they seem really cool and we're going toward them because they're cool and interesting, that could be a distraction from our own internal work. So to me, whenever I get into these realms, my question is always, well, why is this of interest to me? Is there something I'm going to learn and evolve from through the process? And if so, I might be more interested. But if it's just because it's cool and interesting, I have to think twice.
Yeah.
And I tell a story in my book, An End to Upside Down Living, about channeling that I often reference because, like you said, it's a real phenomenon in some cases. There are some people that are legitimately bringing in another intelligence that's speaking through their vocal cords, and their
Yeah.
bodies are moving in all kinds of crazy ways that are not easily explainable. There's actually a study done at the Institute of Noetic Sciences where I've served on the board since 2019, 50 plus years of peer-reviewed research on psychic abilities and things like it. But they put a random number generator machine in the same room as people who are channeling, and they wanted to see if the machine behaved non-randomly when the person was channeling. And the
Hmm.
machines statistically do behave non-randomly when a
Yeah.
person is channeling. So this is one way of demonstrating that there's a real energy. It's not just some psychological disorder, at least for some channelers. But the cautionary story I tell in my book is that this woman was channeling beings and they were helping with her with her life. And one day they said, you should leave your job. And she thought, well, this is not a good idea. I shouldn't do it. And it turned out to be a horrible decision. And she was really upset about it. Then she heard the beings laughing and saying, you should kill yourself.
Hmm.
She realized she was being tricked. And
Yeah.
that's one of the big cautions I have with any of these other realms. I do think there are benevolent beings and benevolent intelligences, but we just have to be aware that there could be deceptive beings. There might be some that are outwardly demonic and they're murderous and they want to torture people, but there are others that are wolves in sheep's clothing and they have an ability to shapeshift and all sorts of other things. So the realms are real, but whether we want to play with them is a different story.
Right. Right. Yeah. Yeah. Oh, totally. Because yeah, you could live a really magical life without getting into this stuff. But if you're called to it and you feel that you're capable of learning it in a way that is sustainable, right? So I am called to it and I do want to be able to handle it and not get and be able to be discerning and discreet and aware along, so I've slowed my process down. I watch a lot of people like me expedite it and go forward into it without doing the shadow work. And then what happens is this wounded part of them ends up getting it hurts other people. They become reckless. They recommend doing things or even tell people you need to do this, like you were talking about. It's such a we're so vulnerable to other people's perceptions. And that's a wound in itself, is that we let other people project onto us and then we change how we think and feel. And that's really hard to come out of that hive mind, even in powerful groups of people that are thinking in dynamic ways. If like the leader in the group has a very clear position on things, you might end up not being comfortable challenging that. And it might just be this small little thing, but that challenging, if done properly, could open the whole group up into a whole nother conversation. And so knowing the timing on what to say and when, and never to get too serious about it. finding a way to enjoy the fact that that we don't know, right? So for the Toltecs, they don't pretend that it's anything but a sheer mystery. Carlos would ask him all these questions, ask Don Juan, and he would sound like riddles. He's trying to help you get to a place where you don't need to know, where you're inside of something really profound, and you've been basically given access to the nonlinear and the eternal and the timelessness that is available even while we're alive. And that's so healing to experience, that the pitfalls that come with knowledge are worth getting to know. And we're going to die anyways. So maybe we can find a way to have adventure and keep our curiosity. And I believe that there is just as much support as there is forces that are trying to challenge us or get us to listen to voices that would, you know, get in the way. And so that's my focus, is that we can recognize that the voices in our head are not our own all the time. And especially when we have a wound or a pattern that gets triggered around whatever relationships, we might go into hearing ideas and concepts that we think are really potentially evolutionary, but they might be really loud, and you can stop those and listen to a more softer side of you, which is really going into your feelings, like you were talking about. That's where the somatic inquiry leads to, is that there's something that needs to be felt and processed, and that we're so in our heads, we're so intellectual that we're avoiding what's really needed. And that just eventually gets too uncomfortable. So finding a way back into our feelings at all times. And yeah.
Yeah, and I also have come to understand that while there are commonalities among all of us and different cautions that we should be aware of, like general principles, we're unique.
Yeah.
And we might even abide by certain archetypes
Yeah.
and things like astrology or gene keys or human design. I don't fully understand them, but I found them to be very resonant and help me understand myself in new ways and understand, well, this path, it actually makes a lot of sense why you'd be interested in this, but not this. But for another person, it would be different.
Yeah.
And it's like what you said before, it's about knowing ourselves and knowing what's our calling and what's not. So I don't think it's a one size fits all. It's
Absolutely.
openness to understand where we're called and then just to do it with the appropriate cautions.
Mm. Yeah, it's cool that you were able to be given a vision of sorts around the first book, and that you had the wherewithal to then act, right? That's a skill that a lot of people don't have. They can get all this incredible clarity, but there's a wound around being able to put it into action. And that's I think perfectionism gets in the way. Did you deal with perfectionism, and did you have to overcome that?
It's been a big part of my journey from way before I wrote this book, of
Yeah.
having to learn how to fail,
Yeah.
learn how to not get the grade I wanted on a test or to lose a tennis match. I mean, tennis was a very good teacher in that way
Wow.
because 50% of the time you lose, or 50% of the people on the court lose. Not hopefully not 50% of the time, but it's a sport where it's especially singles. It's gladiator, and you're not punching each other, but you're trying to take the other person down.
Sure.
And when you're working with people who are training really hard, you're not going to win every match. So when I was young, I used to get super frustrated with it. I mean, it didn't end when I was playing in college, but I
Yeah.
got more and more used to having to deal with failures. And then working in investment banking taught me a lot, especially during the financial crisis. 2008 to 2010 is when I was in New York at
Mm.
UBS Investment Bank on Park Avenue. And I was not a finance major. A lot of the people in my class that were entering the work world in 2008, they went to Wharton or some undergrad business school. I went to Princeton. I was a liberal arts major. So I wasn't quite as familiar on day one with some of the financial stuff. I mean, I went through the trainings, but it wasn't like I was doing it every day in undergrad. So I made mistakes,
Yeah.
and dealing with that in the world of finance, it's a really harsh world. I mean, you
Yeah.
make one mistake on a page where the decimal point is off by one space,
Yeah.
and you hear it from people. So I've made enough mistakes over the years now where the
Yeah.
perfectionism is still there, but I can handle it more. And I put enough work out there that is controversial and heard criticism, and I've learned more and more how to deal with it. So I think
Mm.
that preparation I had, there was a lot of preparation I had for the first 30 years of my life, I think that I needed in order to get to this point to be able to write and speak about this stuff. but I needed that time in order to be able to put books out and not be paralyzed by the perfectionism. Even though if there's a mistake, I do get, there's a part of me that says, oh, why did I miss that? Like if I look back at my first book and end upside down thinking, there are things that I don't fully agree with now. I mean, the overall theme of the book is that consciousness is not produced by the brain. And I show
Cool.
scientific evidence, and I agree with that premise. But there are a
Yeah.
few things, like I talk about Einstein's relativity theory, which
Sure.
now, after looking at cosmology, I don't agree with some of Einstein. And so there's part of me that says, oh, I got that wrong. Another part of me says, well, that's where I was at that part in the journey. I had no reason to question that at the time. And there might be people who actually need to see where I was at that part of at that stage of my journey because it will be resonant with them.
Oh, amazing. Yeah, dude, that's so healing to come out of that need to be recognized or seen. Not everyone's going to see you in this world. Some people are going to recognize you have a unique energy. Other people are just going to see you, whatever projections they have. And I remember Kelly Brogan talking about that she reads each comment and she really tries to imagine that that's true. What they're like the negative stuff, right? That so you're not, and I get other people have too many comments and they're just like have to not ever pay attention to comments. But I've been practicing. I have very little of this yet, but I've had some people say some things, and I just am practicing sitting with that projection and that where that comes from in that person and how it makes me feel. Um, but we have a lot. There's a lot of potential to unbind from the world's projections by getting these little opportunities. They might seem small, but they can be significant. And when you're no longer letting other people's perception of you interfere with your own discovery, you start to have knowledge of self. Where it gets really tricky is in a sexual relationship, because that's where all the wounding surfaces. The closer you get to someone, the more vulnerable those wounds become. And we don't know ourselves yet, and maybe we never will, but the journey to potentially know ourselves, right? So, just for the audience to be aware that it can feel so confusing to be okay when you're alone, and then you move into a relationship and everything gets really difficult. So, but the possibility of learning to be more authentic so that you're telling the difference between what's yours and what you're isn't in harmony with you, because the sacrifices we make in relationships are so confusing. And so maybe a book on communication in relationships would be just fucking intense, right? It's so many worms. It's like opening a can of worms for everyone to just read about these very triggering shadow work concepts. So yeah, if you have anything to add around that.
Yeah, I think relationships of all kinds in the world are mechanisms of showing us things about ourselves and about life, things
Yeah.
that we can't necessarily glean on our own. I mean, we can go to a mountaintop and meditate, and that will teach certain things, but there are certain things I don't think can be learned from that, and vice versa. So there's this
Right.
both and needed of the individualism and then the being with others and collectivism,
Yeah.
that I think is really important. Um, I forgot there was something else I wanted to say, but I forgot. So you go ahead.
Yeah, no worries. Well, and so yeah, well, the one of the women that I work with uh is a mentor, as a therapist, essentially, is Leanne Lapinto, and she is Love Evolved, and it's relationship focused, and it's not just sexual relationships, it's just relationships in general, and it is a very evolutionary path. And I'm in her, not only working with her one-on-one, but I'm in her community, and it's a really strong system to you don't have to go into all this sorcery stuff or into all these truths or unveiling all the deceptions. Yeah, that may not be what everyone wants to get into, because that can be a lot of information. But getting to know where you're at with your wound, with your mom, your dad, your sisters, and with what you're in desire of, getting to know what feels like, what do we allow ourselves to dream forward what we really want to experience? Because that's where it gets really confronting. Is I for a long time couldn't even give myself permission to imagine what it would feel like to feel the things I want to feel. But then I started just doing that. Okay, I don't feel the way I want to feel, but can I imagine what it would feel like? And that led to a huge breakthrough eventually, but it was really uncomfortable to realize how I was checking out of my feelings and just going into my mind and like exiting that process in autopilot. So I've had to learn how to have the ability to go into uncomfortable areas and stay there a little bit longer, and I'm getting stronger because of it. So I appreciate all that you've been through and that you've, had to feel things on a deeper level than, most, because you've gone through such a rapid transformation in such a short period of time, where I've been doing this since the late 90s. I'm I didn't have that same kind of whiplash transition that you went through.
Yeah. Well, I wanted to add on the topic of relationships, the importance also of thinking about ancestral energies and
Yeah.
family constellation. It was something I first did in 2017, of thinking about things happening in my life, relationships and otherwise, and whether they are mirrors of things that happened to various ancestors, things that
Wow.
I might have known about or not. And the idea in family constellation is that painful situations that we find ourselves in now could be subconscious ways of ourselves saying, I love you, to our
Mm,
ancestors who
mm,
went through similar challenges. And the pain that we're experiencing is basically honoring them in some perverse way,
wow.
which is a very challenging thing to think about. So then it makes one go through family history, not just parents and grandparents, to really try to understand what happened to each person. What were the challenging things that they went through that we might be inheriting on an energetic level that we could
Mm,
be replaying because we love them?
wow.
So
Wow.
I think that's a super
Mm,
important other side to think about, because if we
oh,
just get stuck in the here and now of what's happening in a particular relationship and don't consider the metaphysics, we might get a bit lost in it. And I wanted to follow on also on your comment about uh, negative feedback
sure.
and reading comments, because especially the two of us doing things in a more public manner, we're more subjected to that. And with the online world, we might see a comment or get an email and we don't even know who the person is.
Right.
And I do find that the negative comments are more impactful than the positive ones. In other words, I can get 10 positive ones, and if there's one negative one, that one negative one will stick.
Yeah.
And I remember learning about this in psychology, which I studied in college. Losses loom larger than gains.
Mhm.
That's a psychological principle. The losses feel worse than gains feel good. Daniel Kahneman's work. And I've experienced that myself. But to your point, sometimes these comments will have a charge to them, which when I just sit into it and get past the frustration that, okay, this person doesn't even understand me, I think to myself, who would sit there and write that kind of comment? This is someone who's clearly hurting.
Yeah. Oh,
And then I don't feel quite as bad about it. I'm like, okay, if someone had to take the time to write it in that way, there could be a nicer way to say this. This person is going through an issue, and I'm not going to be as worried about it. So I think that's an important. The fact that it comes out in these comments, I think it's reflective of something on the whole in relationships and elsewhere, is that sometimes when a person lashes out at us or says something to us that we don't like, it's often a reflection of their own internal struggle that's being put out onto us. So
yeah.
if we can step back and not take it as personally, very often, if not all the time, the person is just dealing with their own stuff.
Totally. Oh, yeah. It's kind of like you get to see their insanity even, it's like a glimpse into that, to their wound. And yeah, our ability to just have compassion for people's pain, and that the charge comes off so powerfully. And you can even respond to people in a way that liberates, gives them an opportunity to know that isn't dropping to that level. And then you learn so much by how they respond there. So that there's just so much there. Incredible that you've learned to do that. And it's crazy how one thing, one comment can stay with us for days or weeks or months, right? If we don't learn how to recapitulate it, if we don't know how to do something in order to clear the charge that comes with it, because it's kind of like an attack. And I experienced a lot of psychic attacks in my day, having got into hanging out with powerful shamans. I had some really difficult things I went through, and I had to learn how to take care of myself in a different way than most people even know is possible. Like, there are energetic battles that can happen, but you can, on your own end, you can cut the cords and you can clear that stuff. But it's not just by like rolling over and going to sleep. you do have to kind of get up in the middle of the night and deal with whatever's going on in that moment in order to understand what intent is. But yeah, I was given a really powerful catalyst gift. I entered into the Carlos Castaneda subreddit and was welcomed, and what I was sharing was of interest, right? And then I challenged this man in there when he said something that I thought was inaccurate, and the weight of his wound and the power he has in that group, he just unleashed his army on me, right? And I've been banned for life. I cannot defend myself. They've censored me, and they're saying all these ridiculous things that aren't true. And they're saying everything I said in there was made up, right? And so it's just like I got to feel that just wave of energy and attention upon me that was all very, very concentrated and negative. But I had a really profound healing in that I didn't need to defend myself. This is a test for everybody. If they can't see what this dude did, then they're perfectly in place to be there and learn from him. And that's the kind of teachers I had too, was these culty, shadowy teachers that if you don't stay in the lane with them, then you're going to get pushed out. So everyone stays put because they want to learn all these cool tricks. It's intense.
Yeah, I can resonate so much with what you just said. I don't get all that much feedback. I feel like I've been largely ignored, which is good and bad, but I haven't gotten that much attention. So my feedback has been limited. But when I do get some negative feedback, there's that initial kind of shock to the system. I
Yeah.
felt it in you when you were just describing that.
Yeah.
Of it just hits you. And then part of me thinks, okay, I'll sit there with it. And then I think, why is my system so attuned to caring about this? Because there's some part of me that is instinctively caring still.
Yeah.
And it's like showing me what is still unhealed.
Yeah.
So that's the grateful part. And then there's another part of me that wish it didn't happen. And
Yeah.
then on a somewhat related note, I learned this from Richard Massey, who also practices family constellations. The one I worked with in 2017, his name is Carl Buchheit. But what Richard Massey says is that there's a real danger in judgment, because when we judge someone with, the word intent is really important that you said, Joel. If we judge someone with like a critical eye,
Yeah.
like we're actually thinking negatively about them and have that charge to it, then it boomerangs back at us. Versus having an objective assessment.
Yes.
It's a really important distinction because our mind is super powerful in a world that's not purely physical. And if we're imparting this judgment, I have found this too, but when he said it really clicked, that it might come back at another point of our life where we said something about someone and then they say it about us in a different context. And it's like, oh, I was being overly judgmental. But at the same time, we have to be discerning.
Yes.
So if there is a serial killer out there, we need
Yep.
to be objective and say that person is a murderer. We need to do
Yep.
something about it, versus getting really wound up. And we see that so much in the political realm. We can see it in relationships where there's that deeper winding up of the emotions that cause a judgment that can then affect us at a later point in life.
Wow. Oh, so amazing. Yeah. To come out of the drama of judgment, at least suspend judgment in moments, and then to be able to assess the situation from that suspended place. So Don Juan was asked Carlos to pay attention to everybody walking in the streets of Mexico City. And he'd like ask him to make observations of each individual, whether they had energy or not, whether they had, could you tell their habits and patterns and fears based on how they walk, or can you kind of read their thoughts? And this man came around the corner, and Carlos and Don Juan invited him to make an observation, and he said, he drinks too much. And then he's like, oh, sorry, I'm judging. He's like, no, that wasn't a judgment. You were just seeing. It came out of you in a way that was just an assessment. If you would have said that's a drunk bum, then that would have been a judgment. So it's okay to come to terms with what's going on and to have healthy boundaries and to not just let anyone in your home. And sometimes you have to intervene in like, I'll notice that if there's a situation that's getting out of hand, if I don't step in, then no one will. But if I do, then others will. And that has to do with the energy in the room or in that scenario, whoever has the most energy has to act. I swear it's just like we're in a movie. It's like theater, and if you don't say your lines, then everything just goes wrong. Like it just all starts to just. So you have to accept that you're in a movie, and sometimes you have to say the lines. But you can free yourself by becoming an actor that isn't attached to the character that you're playing. And incredible things happen. Like I learned I'm a lot stronger than I realized, that I'm intimidating just by the focus that I have. Even though I'm not large built, I can stand up to people that would typically just think they could swat me away, but somehow they're not comfortable and they start backing up. And then I learned to use that in situations that could be helpful to people. And then I just became more aware of what boundaries are, instead of being like this religious pacifism thing that I think gets really spread in the New Age movement, where we're just supposed to let everyone have their experience. I actually think we are one. And so going back to what you say, when you judge someone, it's instantly like karmic in a sense that the ether connects it all. So when you speak poorly of someone, you're actually speaking poorly of you. And so we are very judgmental of ourselves. We're very self-critical. And how we heal has a lot to do with how we talk about ourselves. And that's a journey in it. Because I'll be sitting there going through my day and I'm like, oh, I'm fucked. Like, because I forgot something. And I'm not fucked. I just forgot something. But that by saying I'm fucked, it just continues to create the potential for things to get kind of out of balance, because I let that in, and that's a real light one compared to some of the more critical things that I say. But I've changed how I talk about myself a lot, and my life has changed accordingly. Yeah.
Yeah, the term that I've used in my books is compassion with discernment.
Mm.
It's really critical for self and others. But
Yeah.
again, others are self at some level, so that it all comes together. But something David Hawkins talked about a lot is uh, people who are very self-critical tend to be very critical of others too.
Yeah.
Or if you're critical of others, you're criticizing something in yourself in some way. So trying to remove that boundary a bit of self and other can be helpful in getting into one's own psychology. And also when we think about, let's say, someone we want to judge,
Mm-hmm.
and again, there needs to be compassion for them because they're part of us and we can see the whatever part of them went astray, but also discerning, like you said, that we need to set boundaries and understand where they're going off the rails. But the compassionate part of us could probably understand why the person is acting that way. Even the serial killer of,
Yep.
well, this person had these things happen in his or her life, and therefore they're acting in this way. And then the next step is, the really hard part is, there's a part within inside of each of us that could have made those same mistakes. If exposed to the same traumas or difficulties, we could have made those mistakes too. So it's not to say the person is absolved from making those mistakes, but it's the understanding that anyone could make those same mistakes and do that given the right circumstances. And therefore the judgmental edge can be lessened.
Amazing, brother. That's so important. And it's very triggering for people to go into this conversation. They want there to be a very black and white, good and bad. That person made a bad choice. That's their fault and only their fault. I didn't make that choice, therefore I'm better. Right. And that just, especially when it comes to pedophilia. But that is, if you look at it, what happened was that person that is seeking to abuse was abused. The energy got caught in their body. They were too young, probably, to even know what happened. They might not even know who they are because of it. And then all this confusion that we have around repressed sexual energy and the fact we don't understand what sexual energy can be used for. And going back to what you said, I mean, I don't know if this is a true story, but this woman went out and purposely got caught by a serial rapist murderer in order to give him a chance to protect her. So he fell asleep. She fell asleep as soon as she got in his car. And that put him in such a confusing situation that he finally had someone to protect and he stopped killing. So
Well,
I talk about women being able to, in a sexual environment where they're being attacked, that there's a way to de-armor the rapist, but it isn't the way you would think. you know, you're gonna have to almost get soft because that throws them off. The softening. They're expecting you to just to defend, and then they can use their power to overpower you. But if you can de-armor them through softness, I mean, the women have the potential to heal this world if we understood what a natural female can do.
Yeah, two things I want to say. The first that comes to mind is Russian martial arts called Sistema,
Yeah.
which I learned about through some friends at Confluence. And it's basically what you're describing, that it teaches you how to flow with anything that is coming at you. So basically, when someone punches you, you're able to flow with it so that your body's not holding the resistance.
Yep.
Or if people are trying to hold you up, you can use your own body's weight against them and you can get out of it without even having to touch them. They just can't hold you. So it's sort
Yep.
of like flowing with the situation and it de-armors in a
Yeah.
very strange way. So this surrendered approach in Sistema, and I think you're doing that in some ways with in the Toltec tradition too, with the magical passes of like flowing and
Yeah.
surrendering and going with the flow of life.
Mhm.
It's paradoxical, but I think it's highly effective. And
Yeah.
another story that comes to mind is one I wrote about in my living book. A woman named Isira, she told this on the Buddha at the Gas Pump podcast, and it really stuck with me. She was being murdered by a man, and all of a sudden the dimensions opened up basically, and she was having almost like a near-death experience that was experienced also by the murderer. And he stopped what he was doing and was like, "Oh my goodness, I'm killing an angel. I'm going to stop." So he took her to the hospital, ended up saving her life, and he ran away.
Wow.
And so she felt his pain in that process and she understood what led him to do that. And
Mm.
therefore she forgave him, but at the same time, it's not like she wanted to be friends with him ever again. So this is the having compassion, but not fully, she's having
Yeah.
the boundaries. So she forgave him and let go of the judgment, but
Wow.
still discerned enough to know that there were big problems.
Wow. Oh, oh, it's so good to know that there's more and more people that are becoming aware of the energetic side, the multidimensional, the ability to have that vision that leads to the emotion healing. And powerful talk today, man. So glad we could do this. Thanks, Mark. Good to be with all of you. Thank you for tapping in, and yeah, tell us how people can find you.
Yeah, well, first, Joel, I want to thank you so much for having me and thanks for all the work you're doing and for all the support you've given me one-on-one and at the retreat in Montana this spring, which I love. So I highly recommend to your audience to work with
Thank
you
you.
if they feel called. My work is available at markgober.com, markgober.com. There are 7 books, all on Amazon in hard copy, Kindle, and Audible formats, and I narrated all the audibles myself. I also have an 8-episode podcast series. It's from 2019, but it's still relevant because it's about consciousness and the brain and the evidence for the afterlife and psychic phenomena. It's called Where Is My Mind? On Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and other major players. And if you do listen to it, I recommend starting at episode 1 because it is like a docuseries, almost chronological, episodes 1 through 8.
Well, it's on my list. I look forward to listening on my next road trip. So good to be with you guys. Thank you, Mark. Much love, everybody, and we'll see you next time.